Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Mr. Jobs English podcast. We're so happy you're here with us again. I'm Mia.
And I'm James, and today we've got a really interesting profession to explore, one that people see almost every week but don't think too much about.
Exactly. Today, we're talking about the butcher, a really important job and full of useful vocabulary for everyday life. And honestly, I've always been curious about how butchers do what they do.
Same. And I think a lot of English learners don't know the specific words for things you find in a butcher shop, or the tools they use, or even how to explain the cut of meat they want.
Yes, that's why this episode is perfect. We're going to talk about common tools, common cuts, common verbs, and real phrases you can use if you ever go to a butcher shop in an English-speaking country.
And we'll do it in a natural conversation like always. No long, boring explanations. Just real English used in real situations.
But let's start simple. When we talk about a butcher, we're talking about the professional who prepares, cuts, trims, and sells meat. This includes beef, pork, poultry, sometimes fish, depending on the shop.
Exactly. And one of the most essential words in a butcher's vocabulary is butcher counter. That's the big refrigerated display where all the cuts of meat are laid out.
And the butcher usually works behind the counter. They wear an apron, usually a heavy one because it needs to protect them from getting stains on their clothes.
And they often wear cut-resistant gloves, which are gloves that help prevent injuries while cutting.
That's a great example of natural vocabulary. Cut-resistant gloves. Gloves that protect your hands so you don't get cut. Simple meaning, but very useful.
Tools are also super important for a butcher. There's the butcher knife, which is a large, heavy knife used for cutting big pieces of meat. There's the cleaver, which is that big square knife people always imagine when they think of butchers.
And they also use a boning knife, which is thinner and more flexible, used for removing bones from meat.
They also use something called a cutting board, obviously, and usually it's very thick and heavy, often plastic or wood.
And to keep all those knives sharp, they use a sharpening steel, also known as a honing rod, that long metal stick that they slide the knife against. That sound always makes me nervous.
The sound of sharpening.
It's a little scary sometimes, but it's important. A sharp knife is safer than a dull one.
Exactly. And another word we should introduce early is cuts, meaning the different ways meat can be divided. For example, steak, ribeye, sirloin, tenderloin, ground beef, pork chops, ribs, and so on.
And one expression you'll hear often from customers is, I'd like 1 pound of, or I'd like half a pound of, because in North America, we use pounds to measure meat.
Yeah, and in Canada too. But sometimes butchers also sell by kilograms depending on the shop.
True. Canada can be so confusing sometimes. Pounds for some things, kilograms for others.
Welcome to North America. But don't worry, at the butcher counter, both systems are common. If a customer says, "Can you give me 1 pound of ground beef?" or "Can I get 500 grams of chicken breast?" the butcher will understand both.
Another super practical word is fat trimming. This means cutting off the excess fat. Customers often say, could you trim the fat, please?
And butchers also slice, chop, grind, weigh, wrap, and label meat every day. These verbs are essential.
Grind means to pass the meat through a machine to make it fine and soft, like ground beef. And wrap means to cover the meat in paper or plastic before giving it to the customer.
Exactly. And butchers also need to clean and sanitize their workspace constantly. Hygiene is a huge part of the job.
Absolutely. Their tables, knives, floor, everything must be super clean. And they use sanitizer, disinfectant, and gloves.
If you're enjoying this episode so far, don't forget to follow our podcast so you don't miss the next profession we explore.
Yes, and now let's keep going because I want to talk about something interesting, the customer experience at a butcher shop.
Oh, I love that. So picture this. You walk into a butcher shop. The first thing you'll probably hear is the butcher saying, "How can I help you today?" Or, "What can I get for you?"
And the customer might respond, I'm looking for a good cut for grilling. Or, do you have any fresh ribs today? These are super common phrases.
And some butchers will ask questions like, "Do you want it thick or thin? Do you want it bone-in or boneless? How many pieces do you need?" Because they customize the cut based on what the customer wants.
Yes, that's something many learners don't know. Butchers can customize almost anything. If you want thicker slices, thinner slices, less fat, no bone, smaller pieces, just ask.
Exactly. And one phrase customers use a lot is, "Could you cut it into smaller pieces?" Or, "Can you grind this for me?"
And sometimes customers ask for fresh meat instead of meat that was previously frozen. A common question is this fresh or previously frozen?
That's a great phrase. Very natural. And here's another word, marbling. That's the little white lines of fat inside the meat.
Yes, and marbling makes the meat more tender and juicy when cooked.
Now, Mia, should we tell them a small story, something that really shows butcher vocabulary in action?
Absolutely. I have one that happened to me in Toronto.
Oh no, if you say it was funny, I already know something went wrong.
So I went to this local butcher shop near my apartment. I wanted to buy chicken breast because I was cooking for some friends. I told the butcher, I'd like 2 pounds of chicken breast, please.
Simple enough.
Yes, except I wasn't paying attention. So he asked me, do you want it trimmed? And I confidently said, yes, thinking it meant something else.
Oh no.
So he trimmed all the fat off, but also cut the chicken into teeny tiny small cubes because he thought I wanted it for a stew. And I didn't realize it until I got home.
So you ended up with chicken pieces the size of dice.
Exactly. I wanted whole chicken breasts to grill. Instead, I had little cubes. I had to change the whole dinner plan.
That's such a classic language moment. And the vocabulary in this story is great. Trim, fat, cubes, stew, whole, chicken breast.
Yes, and the moral is always pay attention to the butcher's questions.
That's such a classic butcher story. And it shows how important communication is in a butcher shop.
And for learners, phrases like whole piece, sliced, cubed, boneless, skinless, trimmed, thick cut, thin cut, all of these are super useful.
Exactly. And we'll use some of them again later in the episode.
Another essential area is safety vocabulary. Butchers need to use terms like sanitize, disinfect, cross-contamination, and temperature control.
Yes, cross-contamination is when bacteria from raw meat spread to other foods or surfaces. Butchers are trained to avoid that.
And temperature control means keeping meat cold enough so it stays safe. So far, we've introduced a lot of vocabulary naturally. Tools like cleaver, boning knife, cutting board, actions like trim, slice, grind, weigh, wrap, customer phrases, safety words, and we're just getting started.
Exactly. And all of this vocabulary is super practical. You can use it in real life. So before we move into more details later, let's just highlight how important communication is between a butcher and a customer. Most problems happen when people aren't sure how to describe the cut they want.
Yes, like my chicken cubes.
Exactly.
So, James, before we jump back into our story inside the butcher shop, I was thinking about something. Many people who are learning English don't really know what a butcher's daily routine looks like. They think it's only about cutting meat, but it's so much more than that.
Oh, definitely. A butcher does way more than just cutting. There's preparing, organizing, cleaning, helping customers, giving advice, selecting cuts, and even making things like sausages or ground beef. And every country has its own style. In Canada, for example, people really love cuts like sirloin, strip loin, and ribeye. And in the US, ground beef is a big deal because of burgers.
And the vocabulary around it is super different from everyday English. Like the word counter. Usually for students, counter means the place in the kitchen. But in a butcher shop, counter is the service area where you talk to the butcher.
Right, and display case is the cold glass section where all the cuts are shown. It's good for students to imagine it, cold air, a bright light, pieces of meat organized by cut, color, and size.
That's why, when our mini story starts again, right now, it's a great moment to show vocabulary in action. This helps the listeners truly feel inside the butcher shop. So let's continue exactly from where we stopped.
Yes, we left our character waiting at the counter with a big question. Which cut should I buy for a family barbecue?
Exactly. So here we go. Our main character, Daniel, steps closer to the counter. The butcher, Mr. Collins, is a friendly man in his 50s with a clean apron and strong hands. And Daniel says, "Hi, I need advice. I'm having a big barbecue. What cut do you recommend?"
And this is where the vocabulary gets interesting, because Mr. Collins doesn't just give a simple answer. He begins with, "That depends. Are you grilling something fast or something slow?"
And Daniel looks a little confused, which is normal for English learners too. So he says, "Well, fast, I think." And Mr. Collins smiles and says, "Then you should try ribeye or sirloin. They cook quickly and stay juicy." This is a perfect vocabulary moment. Juicy. Students hear this all the time, especially in food descriptions. It simply means the meat has a lot of natural liquid and tastes better.
I love the word juicy. And then Daniel asks the classic question, what's the difference between ribeye and sirloin? Many customers ask that. So Mr. Collins explains it. The simple way is ribeye has more fat. Fat means flavor. Sirloin has less fat, so it's a little leaner, but still tender. Now, lean is another essential word. It means not having much fat.
And tender means soft and easy to chew. These words are essential in butcher vocabulary. And they're also great everyday words. You can talk about tender chicken, tender vegetables, anything that's easy to bite. So Daniel listens carefully and then says, ribeye sounds good, but what about chicken? My aunt doesn't eat beef.
And Mr. Collins replies, no problem. Do you want chicken breast, chicken thighs, or wings? And this is fantastic because many English students know breast, but not thighs. Thighs are the upper part of the leg, and they stay juicy because of the natural fat.
Daniel chooses chicken thighs, and then the butcher starts preparing everything. And here is another great vocabulary moment, the verb to trim. Trimming means removing the extra fat or unwanted parts to make the meat cleaner. So the butcher says, "I'll trim the chicken for you." And the metal sound of the knife hitting the cutting board makes the moment feel real.
I love that detail. And do you remember the next part? He asks for something unexpected.
Oh, yes. He suddenly says, "Do you also have ground beef?" And Mr. Collins looks surprised because barbecue plus ground beef usually means one thing, burgers. So he asks, "Are you making burgers too?" And Daniel says, "Maybe, if I have time."
So the butcher explains that ground beef has different levels of fat, extra lean, lean, and regular. And this is essential vocabulary. Lean, we already explained. Extra lean means even less fat, but regular has more fat, which is good for flavor. Daniel chooses lean because he wants something balanced.
The story then moves to the payment counter, but before paying, Daniel remembers something important. He says, "Wait, do you also sell spices?" and the butcher laughs and points to a small shelf with salt, pepper, garlic powder, and paprika. Simple words, but extremely useful for someone working or buying in a butcher shop.
And then comes the funniest moment. Daniel looks at a giant knife hanging on the wall and says, "Wow, that's huge! Is it for cutting dinosaurs?" And Mr. Collins laughs so hard that he almost drops a package. This creates a nice natural humor moment. And then he explains, "That's a butcher's knife. It's for cutting big pieces. But no dinosaurs today."
It's a great moment because it connects the listener emotionally. And the best part is that it uses simple English with natural humor. And humor is important when learning new vocabulary because it makes the words stay in your memory.
Now, after the mini story, let's slow down just a little bit and review the essential vocabulary naturally. And remember, we don't list anything, we just talk about it in a natural conversational way. For example, I really liked the moment when the butcher explained trim. Many people don't know this verb and it's used a lot in butcher shops.
Yes, and I also liked the moment when he explained lean. Lean meat is something people ask for all the time. And even outside of butcher vocabulary, the word lean is useful. You can say lean protein in fitness conversations, or say something is lean when it's simple and without extra parts. Another important word from the story is counter. English learners usually think of the kitchen counter, but in a store, it means the place where you talk to the employee. And in a butcher shop, the counter is always cold, clean, and organized because it holds fresh meat.
And the word display case, that's where the meat is shown. It's basically the showcase with cold temperature and a glass front. Every butcher shop has one. And it's funny because many students don't know the word, but see it all the time in supermarkets.
There's also the vocabulary for cuts: ribeye, sirloin, chicken breast, chicken thighs. These are extremely common, and learners will hear them in restaurants, cooking shows, and recipes.
And the moment when Daniel talks about burgers brings the vocabulary ground beef. It's one of the most common ingredients in North American kitchens. And the categories, extra lean, lean, and regular, help the listener understand how fat and flavor work together.
Now, another thing that I love about this story is that it shows how a butcher communicates. A butcher doesn't talk like a chef. A chef uses more technical words, but a butcher talks simply, directly, and clearly. So this helps our listeners understand natural, everyday English.
And butchers usually speak with confidence because they work with heavy tools. The knife vocabulary is essential too. Even though we didn't list tools separately, we saw the words knife and cutting board naturally appear in the story. If listeners pay attention, they'll start repeating these words without even noticing.
That's my favorite part of storytelling inside the dialogue. We teach without sounding like we're teaching. The listener feels like they're inside the butcher shop, not in a classroom.
Exactly. And another natural detail is the sound, the knife hitting the board. We didn't exaggerate anything. We just described something you really hear in a butcher shop. That makes the story more immersive.
Speaking of immersion, I also like how Daniel asked for advice naturally. Many English learners don't know how to ask, "What do you recommend?" It's a simple question, but very useful when shopping.
And the butcher's answer, "That depends," is very natural, and learners will hear it everywhere, not only in butcher shops.
Now, before we close this part, I want to add one more piece of vocabulary that fits perfectly with today's profession: the word fresh. Every butcher cares about fresh meat, and fresh simply means recently prepared, not old, not frozen.
Yes, and this is something listeners must know because fresh beef, fresh chicken, and fresh cut are very common phrases in North America.
Perfect. Now that we explored vocabulary, story moments, and natural expressions, we can slowly guide the listener toward a small recap. Again, naturally, not like a textbook. So, James, if you had to summarize what Daniel learned at the butcher shop today, how would you say it?
I'd say he learned how to choose cuts, how to describe meat using practical words, and how to ask the butcher for advice in simple English. He learned the difference between lean and regular meat, understood ribeye versus sirloin, and discovered that chicken thighs stayed juicier than chicken breast. And of course, he learned that butcher knives look like dinosaur tools.
And he also learned to pay attention to the display case so he can see all the cuts before choosing.
And he learned that humor helps when you're nervous talking to a professional in English.
That's true. Now, before we finish this part of the episode, let's remind our listeners of something important. If you want to improve your English, you need exposure. So listening to real situations, like today's butcher shop experience, helps your brain connect vocabulary to real life.
And you don't need to memorize anything. Just listen, enjoy, and repeat sometimes. The more you hear natural English, the easier it becomes.
Now we're getting close to the moment when the final part of the episode will connect everything in a review and give the listeners more practice.
So stay right here because the next part brings everything together.
And of course, if you're enjoying this episode so far, remember our final message at the end, but we'll save that for later.
Oh yes, we only say it at the end.
Perfect. Let's continue soon. So, James, before we move into the next part of the story inside the butcher shop, I want to talk about something many English students struggle with, describing meat textures in natural English. And I think this is a perfect moment to explore that, because our story is heading toward another fun interaction between Daniel and the butcher.
Absolutely. Texture is one of those things that native speakers mention all the time without thinking. Words like tender, chewy, juicy, crispy, and even tough. And the butcher environment is full of these words. When people buy meat, they always ask, is this tender? Or will this turn out juicy on the grill?
And this is a great moment in the episode because we're going to bring those words into the story naturally. No lists, no teaching tone, just natural conversation inside the scene. Speaking of scenes, let's go back to where Daniel was about to leave the butcher shop with his meat. But suddenly, something unexpected happens.
Oh yes, the moment that changes everything. Daniel is walking toward the door, carrying his bag with the ribeye, chicken thighs, and ground beef. And he hears the butcher call out, "Wait, I forgot to ask, how many people are coming to your barbecue?" And Daniel stops, turns around, and says, I think around 15. And the butcher opens his eyes wide and says, 15? You bought meat for maybe 5.
And that's when Daniel realizes he completely miscalculated. And this leads to a great piece of natural vocabulary, to run out. The butcher says, "You're going to run out of meat."
That's a perfect everyday phrase. Run out means fikar seng. But of course, we don't say that in the episode. We explain it naturally in English. So the butcher says, run out means you won't have enough. People will be hungry. You need more.
Daniel looks stressed, and the butcher laughs again and says, "Don't worry, I'll help you." So Daniel returns to the counter, puts the bag down, and says, "Okay, tell me what I need." And the butcher begins looking around the display case again. This moment gives us a new chance to introduce vocabulary about quantity and portion sizes.
Right. The butcher says, for a barbecue, a good rule is 1 steak per adult. And Daniel says, 1 whole steak? And the butcher says, yes, ribeye, sirloin, whatever you choose. And then the butcher continues, and if you're serving chicken too, people might eat half a steak and some chicken. So you need balance. And the word balance is great because it's used in food, nutrition, schedules, money. It's a universal word.
Then Daniel asks the most real question ever, "How do you know so much about this?" And the butcher laughs and says, "Because I've been a butcher for 25 years. And this brings us to another great vocabulary moment, experience. The butcher naturally says, experience teaches you everything. Students hear the word experience all the time, and it's perfect in this context.
And now comes one of my favorite parts of the story. The butcher walks to a big piece of beef on the table and says, "I'll cut more ribeye for you." And this is the moment where we get to bring in the sound details. You hear the soft slice of the knife going through the meat. Not exaggerated, just the natural sound of cutting. And the butcher says, "This one is very tender. It's from a good part of the rib section."
And Daniel asks, how can you tell it's tender? And the butcher explains simply, you can see the marbling. And here we get one of the most important vocabulary words in the entire butcher world, marbling. Marbling means the little white lines of fat inside the meat. And the butcher explains it in totally natural English. He says, marbling makes the meat juicy. Fat melts when cooking. That gives flavor.
And Daniel's reaction is perfect. He says, "So fat isn't bad?" And the butcher shrugs and replies, "Not here. Fat is flavor." And that's actually a very common North American phrase. Chefs and butchers say it all the time.
The butcher cuts the meat, prepares everything, and places it in a new package. But this is where the story takes a funny turn. Daniel notices a sign behind the counter that says, fresh sausages, ask for today's flavor. And he says, you make sausages too? And the butcher proudly answers, of course. Today we have garlic sausage, spicy sausage, and herb sausage.
And then Daniel asks, "Should I get some for the barbecue?" And the butcher laughs and says, "If you don't, your guests will ask why you didn't." This is a great example of natural persuasion vocabulary. The butcher isn't pushing aggressively, he's giving friendly advice.
So Daniel buys a pack of sausages, and this gives us the chance to explore another vocabulary moment, flavor. The butcher explains flavor means the taste of something. Garlic flavor, spicy flavor, herb flavor, all different. And Daniel repeats flavor, flavor, trying to remember it.
After choosing the sausages, Daniel asks the butcher a question that many English learners also have. How do I store all this? Can I keep it outside, or do I refrigerate everything? And the butcher answers immediately, always refrigerate. Meat must stay cold. And this introduces the word refrigerate naturally, without teaching tone.
Then the butcher explains, if you're not using the meat today, you can freeze it. And Daniel says, freeze, like ice? And the butcher says, yes, but freezing changes the texture a little. Fresh is always better.
That's a perfect, tiny lesson on fresh and freeze, right inside the story.
Now, while the butcher prepares the final packages, Daniel starts looking around the shop and noticing the different tools. A long knife, a short knife, a cutting board, a large meat grinder. And he says, do you use these every day? And the butcher says, every single day. And this is where the butcher naturally uses the word routine. He says, this is part of my routine. I sharpen the knives, check the temperature, organize the display case, cut meat, help customers.
That's great, because learners hear the word routine in many contexts, not only at a butcher, but here it appears in a natural, real environment.
Then Daniel asks the butcher one more question. What's the hardest part of your job? And the butcher says, keeping everything clean. And that's where the word sanitize comes in naturally. The butcher explains, I sanitize everything after I use it. Knives, boards, tables, everything. And then he adds, a clean shop is the most important thing.
And that is real butcher vocabulary. Not complicated, not technical, just practical English used every day.
Now it's time for one of my favorite moments in the entire story. Daniel pays for all the meat, thanks the butcher, and begins walking out of the shop again. But then the butcher says, wait, don't forget the most important thing. And Daniel stops, confused, and asks, what is it now? And the butcher says, enjoy the barbecue.
It's such a simple moment, but it says so much. It shows warmth, hospitality, and natural communication.
And Daniel finally leaves the shop, carrying a very heavy bag now. And here comes a tiny detail that makes the story feel natural. When Daniel steps outside, he says, "Wow, this is heavier than my gym bag." And this brings us to a small vocabulary moment. Heavy is a very basic word, but students often misuse it. They sometimes say strong or hard, but heavy is the correct word for weight.
And Daniel walks down the street imagining the barbecue, thinking about the ribeye, the chicken, the sausages, and the ground beef. He practices the vocabulary in his head: marbling, tender, lean, juicy. This is exactly what our listeners should be doing too, practicing mentally without pressure.
This is why storytelling works so well in language learning. Listeners naturally connect words with images, sounds, situations. They don't just memorize vocabulary, they feel the vocabulary.
Now that the story reached that moment, we can go into another natural conversation between us, something that adds even more value to the listener. How to talk to a butcher confidently in English.
That's a great idea. So, James, if someone wants to say, "I need help choosing a cut," how would they say that naturally?
They'd say, "Can you help me choose a cut?" Or, "What do you recommend?" Simple, practical, and natural.
And if they want something specific trimmed or prepared?
They could say, "Can you trim the fat?" Or, "Can you cut this thinner?" Or, "Can you slice this for me?" Butchers hear sentences like these every day.
And for portion sizes?
They can say, "How much do I need for 5 people?" Or, "Is this enough?" These questions help a lot and feel natural.
This entire episode teaches our listeners something powerful. You don't need complicated English to communicate with a professional. You need natural English, simple sentences, clear requests.
And confidence. Confidence is everything. When you walk into a butcher shop in Canada or the US, people speak fast. They're working, but they're also friendly. If you ask clearly, they respond clearly.
And our story proves it. Daniel started nervous, confused, not sure how to choose meat. But after talking with the butcher, he left with knowledge, vocabulary, and confidence.
And a very heavy bag.
That too. But now comes the final part of the episode soon. The big review, the emotional closing, and our traditional message to the listeners.
I love that part. But first, we finish this section right here.
Perfect. All right, James. Before we wrap up the episode, I want to go back to something I've been thinking about since the beginning of our conversation. It's amazing how a simple visit to a butcher shop can teach so much English. Not only vocabulary, but confidence, rhythm, real communication. Daniel's little adventure shows exactly how English works in real life.
Exactly. And it also shows how professionals, like butchers, use a very specific language every day. Words that aren't complicated, just practical. When he learned words like tender, marbling, lean, ground beef, and cut, he wasn't studying, he was communicating. That's the whole point of this podcast.
And honestly, what I love most is how the butcher helped him. It wasn't formal, it wasn't textbook English. It was friendly, natural, and full of useful expressions. That moment when the butcher said, "Run out" means you won't have enough, was so simple, but so real.
I really like that too. And you know what else I loved? When Daniel realized the bag was heavier than his gym bag. That's the kind of detail that makes the story stick in your mind. Because everyone understands that feeling. And when English connects to something emotional or funny, you remember it better.
And the butcher had his own charm. That line, "Fat is flavor," is something you hear in almost every butcher shop in North America. It's such a cultural thing. It's not only about cooking, it's about identity, tradition, weekend barbecues, family gatherings.
True. And speaking of culture, it's interesting how meat cuts vary between the US and Canada.
Sometimes we use the same names, sometimes different. But the idea is always the same. People want something that tastes good and feels right for their cooking style.
And the vocabulary that came naturally in today's episode is perfect for a beginner or intermediate English learner. Words like slice, cut, grind, trim, tender, juicy, fresh, flavor, texture, portion. All real, simple, and practical.
Plus the action verbs that butchers use all day. Chop, prepare, weigh, wrap, refrigerate, freeze, sanitize. These words appear in many jobs, not just in butcher shops. That makes them even more valuable.
Exactly. And when Daniel asked, "How do I store this?" and the butcher answered instantly, "Refrigerate it, keep it cold, and freeze only if necessary." That's real communication. No long explanations, just honest help.
And I think that's an important message for listeners. Communication doesn't depend on perfect grammar. It depends on clarity. If you say, "Can you cut this thinner?" or "How much do I need for 6 people?" everyone understands. That's the beauty of English used in real places.
And I hope listeners felt that during the story. The sounds, the conversation, the little details like the grinder, the display case, the tools the butcher uses. All of this builds understanding in a natural way.
And one more thing. Daniel's curiosity helped him. He asked questions, simple ones. And that's a great tip for anyone learning English. If you ask, you learn. If you stay silent, you miss opportunities.
I love that. And it brings us to our final reflection of the episode. Learning professional vocabulary doesn't need to be boring. It can come from daily life, from a visit to the butcher, the grocery store, the bakery, the dentist, anywhere. Real English comes from real situations.
And I think today's conversation showed that perfectly. We explored tools, verbs, expressions, customer interaction, cultural notes, and a mini-story that made everything feel alive. And Daniel walked out of the shop not only with his meat, but also with more English in his head.
And probably stronger arms, too.
He definitely needed them. That bag was full of ribeye, chicken, sausages, and everything else.
This was a great episode, and I hope our listeners feel more confident about speaking English in real situations, especially in places like butcher shops where specific vocabulary appears naturally.
And I hope they use words like marbling and tender the next time they buy meat. Those words really make you sound natural.
Before we close, James, do you have a final message for listeners?
Yes, don't be afraid to speak. Don't worry about mistakes. Just talk. Ask questions. Use the words you learned today. English grows when you use it.
Beautifully said.
Thank you.
And now, to all our amazing listeners, if you enjoyed today's episode, follow the podcast, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which profession you want us to talk about next.
See you in the next episode.
Bye, everyone.